Chapter 3 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 6, Le Petit Picpus. Chapter 3, Austerities. One is a postulant for 2 years at least, often for 4, a novice for 4. It is rare that the definitive vows can be pronounced earlier than the age of 23 or 24 years. The Bernardines Benedictines of Martin Verga do not admit widows to their order. In their cells they deliver themselves up to many unknown macerations of which they must never speak. On the day when a novice makes her profession, she is dressed in her handsomest attire. She is crowned with white roses, her hair is brushed until it shines, and curled. Then she prostrates herself, a great black veil is thrown over her, and the office for the dead is sung. Then the nuns separate into 2 files. One file passes close to her, saying in plaintive accents, "Our sister is dead," and the other file responds in a voice of ecstasy, "Our sister is alive in Jesus Christ." At the epoch when this story takes place, a boarding school was attached to the convent, a boarding school for young girls of noble and mostly wealthy families, among whom could be remarked Mademoiselle de Saint-Aulaire and de Bellisson, and an English girl bearing the illustrious Catholic name of Talbot. These young girls, reared by these nuns between 4 walls, grew up with a horror of the world and of the age. One of them said to us one day, "The sight of the street pavement made me shudder from head to foot." They were dressed in blue, with a white cap, and a Holy Spirit of silver gilt or of copper on their breast. On certain grand festival days, particularly St. Martha's Day, they were permitted, as a high favour and a supreme happiness, to dress themselves as nuns, and to carry out the offices and practice of Saint Benoît for a whole day. In the early days the nuns were in the habit of lending them their black garments. This seemed profane, and the prioress forbade it. Only the novices were permitted to lend. It is remarkable that these performances, tolerated and encouraged, no doubt, in the convent out of a secret spirit of proselytism, and in order to give these children a foretaste of the holy habit, were a genuine happiness and a real recreation for the scholars. They simply amused themselves with it. It was new, it gave them a change. Candid reasons of childhood, which do not, however, succeed in making us worldlings comprehend the felicity of holding a holy water sprinkler in one's hand, and standing for hours together singing hard enough for 4 in front of a reading desk. The pupils conformed, with the exception of the austerities, to all the practices of the convent. There was a certain young woman who entered the world, and who, after many years of married life, had not succeeded in breaking herself of the habit of saying in great haste whenever any one knocked at her door, "Forever." Like the nuns, the pupils saw their relatives only in the parlour. Their very mothers did not obtain permission to embrace them. The following illustrates to what a degree severity on that point was carried. One day a young girl received a visit from her mother, who was accompanied by a little sister 3 years of age. The young girl wept, for she wished greatly to embrace her sister. Impossible. She begged that at least the child might be permitted to pass her little hand through the bars, so that she could kiss it. This was almost indignantly refused. End of Book 6, Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 6, Le Petit Picpus. Chapter 4, Gaieties. None the less, these young girls filled this grave house with charming souvenirs. At certain hours, childhood sparkled in that cloister. The recreation hour struck. A door swung on its hinges. The birds said, "Good, here come the children." An eruption of youth inundated that garden intersected with a cross, like a shroud. Radiant faces, white foreheads, innocent eyes, full of merry light. All sorts of auroras were scattered about amid these shadows. After the psalmodies, the bells, the peals, and knells, and offices, the sound of these little girls burst forth on a sudden, more sweetly than the noise of bees. The hive of joy was opened, and each one brought her honey. They played, they called to each other, they formed into groups, they ran about. Pretty little white teeth chattered in the corners. The veils superintended the laughs from a distance. Shades kept watch of the sunbeams. But what mattered it? Still they beamed and laughed. Those 4 lugubrious walls had their moment of dazzling brilliancy. They looked on, vaguely blanched with the reflection of so much joy at this sweet swarming of the hives. It was like a shower of roses falling athwart this house of mourning. The young girls frolicked beneath the eyes of the nuns. The gaze of impeccability does not embarrass innocence. Thanks to these children, there was, among so many austere hours, 1 hour of ingenuousness. The little ones skipped about, the elder ones danced. In this cloister, play was mingled with heaven. Nothing is so delightful and so august as all these fresh, expanding young souls. Homer would have come thither to laugh with Perrault, and there was in that black garden youth, health, noise, cries, giddiness, pleasure, happiness enough to smooth out the wrinkles of all their ancestresses, those of the epic as well as those of the fairy tale, those of the throne as well as those of the thatched cottage, from Hecuba to la Mère Grand. In that house more than anywhere else, perhaps, arise those children's sayings which are so graceful, and which evoke a smile that is full of thoughtfulness. It was between those 4 gloomy walls that a child of 5 years exclaimed one day, "Mother, one of the big girls has just told me that I have only 9 years and 10 months longer to remain here. What happiness!" It was here, too, that this memorable dialogue took place. A vocal mother: "Why are you weeping, my child?" The child, aged 6: "I told Alex that I knew my French history. She says that I do not know it, but I do." Alex, the big girl, aged 9: "No, she does not know it." The mother: "How is that, my child?" Alex: "She told me to open the book at random and to ask her any question in the book, and she would answer it." "Well?" "She did not answer it." "Let us see about it. What did you ask her?" "I opened the book at random as she proposed, and I put the first question that I came across." "And what was the question?" "It was, what happened after that?" It was there that that profound remark was made anent a rather greedy paroquet, which belonged to a lady boarder. "How well bred! It eats the top of the slice of bread and butter just like a person." It was on one of the flagstones of this cloister that there was once picked up a confession, which had been written out in advance in order that she might not forget it, by a sinner of 7 years. "Father, I accuse myself of having been avaricious. Father, I accuse myself of having been an adulteress. Father, I accuse myself of having raised my eyes to the gentleman." It was on one of the turf benches of this garden that a rosy mouth 6 years of age improvised the following tale, which was listened to by blue eyes aged 4 and 5 years. There were 3 little cocks who owned a country where there were a great many flowers. They plucked the flowers and put them in their pockets. After that they plucked the leaves and put them in their playthings. There was a wolf in that country. There was a great deal of forest, and the wolf was in the forest, and he ate the little cocks. And this other poem. There came a blow with a stick. It was Punchinello who bestowed it on the cat. It was not good for her, it hurt her. Then a lady put Punchinello in prison. It was there that a little abandoned child, a foundling whom the convent was bringing up out of charity, uttered this sweet and heart-breaking saying. She heard the others talking of their mothers, and she murmured in her corner, "As for me, my mother was not there when I was born." There was a stout portress who could always be seen hurrying through the corridors with her bunch of keys, and whose name was Sister Agatha. The big girls, those over 10 years of age, called her Agathocles. The refectory, a large apartment of an oblong square form, which received no light except through a vaulted cloister on a level with the garden, was dark and damp, and, as the children say, full of beasts. All the places round about furnished their contingent of insects. Each of its 4 corners had received, in the language of the pupils, a special and expressive name. There was Spider Corner, Caterpillar Corner, Woodlouse Corner, and Cricket Corner. Cricket Corner was near the kitchen, and was highly esteemed. It was not so cold there as elsewhere. From the refectory the names had passed to the boarding school, and there served, as in the old college Mazarin, to distinguish 4 nations. Every pupil belonged to one of these 4 nations according to the corner of the refectory in which she sat at meals. One day, Monseigneur the Archbishop, while making his pastoral visit, saw a pretty little rosy girl with beautiful golden hair enter the classroom through which he was passing. He inquired of another pupil, a charming brunette with rosy cheeks, who stood near him, "Who is that?" "She is a spider, Monseigneur." "Bah! And that one yonder?" "She is a cricket." "And that one?" "She is a caterpillar." "Really? And yourself?" "I am a woodlouse, Monseigneur." Every house of this sort has its own peculiarities. At the beginning of this century, Écouen was one of those strict and graceful places where young girls pass their childhood in a shadow that is almost august. At Écouen, in order to take rank in the procession of the Holy Sacrament, a distinction was made between virgins and florists. There were also the dais and the censors, the first who held the cords of the dais, and the others who carried incense before the Holy Sacrament. The flowers belonged by right to the florists. 4 virgins walked in advance. On the morning of that great day, it was no rare thing to hear the question put in the dormitory, "Who is a virgin?" Madame Campan used to quote this saying of a little one of 7 years to a big girl of 16 who took the head of the procession, while she, the little one, remained at the rear. "You are a virgin, but I am not." End of Book 6, Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 6, Le Petit Picpus, Chapter 5, Distractions. Above the door of the refectory this prayer, which was called the White Paternoster, and which possessed the property of bearing people straight to Paradise, was inscribed in large black letters. Little white Paternoster which God made, which God said, which God placed in Paradise. In the evening, when I went to bed, I found 3 angels sitting on my bed, 1 at the foot, 2 at the head, the good Virgin Mary in the middle, who told me to lie down without hesitation. The good God is my Father, the good Virgin is my mother, the 3 apostles are my brothers, the 3 virgins are my sisters. The shirt in which God was born envelops my body. St. Margaret's cross is written on my breast. Madame the Virgin was walking through the meadows weeping for God when she met Monsieur St. John. Monsieur St. John, whence come you? I come from Ave Salus. You have not seen the good God. Where is he? He is on the tree of the cross, his feet hanging, his hands nailed, a little cap of white thorns on his head. Whoever shall say this thrice at eventide, thrice in the morning, shall win Paradise at the last. In 1827, this characteristic orison had disappeared from the wall under a triple coating of daubing paint. At the present time it is finally disappearing from the memories of several who were young girls then, and who are old women now. A large crucifix fastened to the wall completed the decoration of this refectory, whose only door, as we think we have mentioned, opened on the garden. 2 narrow tables, each flanked by 2 wooden benches, formed 2 long parallel lines from one end to the other of the refectory. The walls were white, the tables were black. These 2 mourning colours constitute the only variety in convents. The meals were plain, and the food of the children themselves severe. A single dish of meat and vegetables combined, or salt fish, such was their luxury. This meagre fare, which was reserved for the pupils alone, was nevertheless an exception. The children ate in silence under the eye of the mother whose turn it was, who, if a fly took a notion to fly or to hum against the rule, opened and shut a wooden book from time to time. This silence was seasoned with the lives of the saints, read aloud from a little pulpit with a desk, which was situated at the foot of the crucifix. The reader was one of the big girls in weekly turn. At regular distances on the bare tables there were large varnished bowls, in which the pupils washed their own silver cups and knives and forks, and into which they sometimes threw some scrap of tough meat or spoiled fish. This was punished. These bowls were called rondeaux. The child who broke the silence made a cross with her tongue. Where? On the ground. She licked the pavement. The dust, that end of all joys, was charged with the chastisement of those poor little rose-leaves which had been guilty of chirping. There was in the convent a book which has never been printed except as a unique copy, and which it is forbidden to read. It is the Rule of Saint Benoît, an arcanum which no profane eye must penetrate. Nemo regulas seu constitutiones nostras externis communicabit. The pupils one day succeeded in getting possession of this book, and set to reading it with avidity, a reading which was often interrupted by the fear of being caught, which caused them to close the volume precipitately. From the great danger thus incurred, they derived but a very moderate amount of pleasure. The most interesting thing they found were some unintelligible pages about the sins of young boys. They played in an alley of the garden bordered with a few shabby fruit trees. In spite of the extreme surveillance and the severity of the punishments administered, when the wind had shaken the trees, they sometimes succeeded in picking up a green apple, or a spoiled apricot, or an inhabited pear on the sly. I will now cede the privilege of speech to a letter which lies before me, a letter written 25 years ago by an old pupil, now Madame la Duchesse de Blank, one of the most elegant women in Paris. I quote literally: "One hides one's pear or one's apple as best one may. When one goes upstairs to put the veil on the bed before supper, one stuffs them under one's pillow, and at night one eats them in bed. And when one cannot do that, one eats them in the closet." That was one of their greatest luxuries. Once, it was at the epoch of the visit from the Archbishop to the convent, one of the young girls, Mlle. Bouchard, who was connected with the Montmorency family, laid a wager that she would ask for a day's leave of absence, an enormity in so austere a community. The wager was accepted, but not one of those who bet believed that she would do it. When the moment came, as the Archbishop was passing in front of the pupils, Mlle. Bouchard, to the indescribable terror of her companions, stepped out of the ranks and said, "Monseigneur, a day's leave of absence." Mlle. Bouchard was tall, blooming, with the prettiest little rosy face in the world. Monsieur de Quélen smiled and said, "What, my dear child, a day's leave of absence? 3 days, if you like. I grant you 3 days." The prioress could do nothing. The Archbishop had spoken. Horror of the convent, but joy of the pupil. The effect may be imagined. This stern cloister was not so well walled off, however, but that the life of the passions of the outside world, drama, and even romance, did not make their way in. To prove this, we will confine ourselves to recording here and to briefly mentioning a real and incontestable fact, which, however, bears no reference in itself to, and is not connected by any thread whatever with the story which we are relating. We mention the fact for the sake of completing the physiognomy of the convent in the reader's mind. About this time there was in the convent a mysterious person who was not a nun, who was treated with great respect, and who was addressed as Madame Albertine. Nothing was known about her, save that she was mad, and that in the world she passed for dead. Beneath this history, it was said there lay the arrangements of fortune necessary for a great marriage. This woman, hardly 30 years of age, of dark complexion and tolerably pretty, had a vague look in her large black eyes. Could she see? There was some doubt about this. She glided rather than walked. She never spoke. It was not quite known whether she breathed. Her nostrils were livid and pinched, as after yielding up their last sigh. To touch her hand was like touching snow. She possessed a strange, spectral grace. Wherever she entered, people felt cold. One day a sister, on seeing her pass, said to another sister, "She passes for a dead woman." "Perhaps she is one," replied the other. 100 tales were told of Madame Albertine. This arose from the eternal curiosity of the pupils. In the chapel there was a gallery called l'œil de bœuf. It was in this gallery, which had only a circular bay, an œil de bœuf, that Madame Albertine listened to the offices. she always occupied it alone, because this gallery, being on the level of the first story, the preacher or the officiating priest could be seen, which was interdicted to the nuns. One day the pulpit was occupied by a young priest of high rank, Monsieur le Duc de Rohan, peer of France, officer of the Red Musketeers in 1815, when he was Prince de Léon, and who died afterward in 1830 as Cardinal and Archbishop of Besançon. It was the first time that Monsieur de Rohan had preached at the Petit Picpus convent. Madame Albertine usually preserved perfect calmness and complete immobility during the sermons and services. That day, as soon as she caught sight of Monsieur de Rohan, she half rose and said in a loud voice, amid the silence of the chapel, "Ah, Auguste!" The whole community turned their heads in amazement. The preacher raised his eyes, but Madame Albertine had relapsed into her immobility. A breath from the outer world, a flash of life, had passed for an instant across that cold and lifeless face, and had then vanished, and the mad woman had become a corpse again. Those 2 words, however, had set every one in the convent who had the privilege of speech to chattering. How many things were contained in that "Ah, Auguste!" What revelations! Monsieur de Rohan's name really was Auguste. It was evident that Madame Albertine belonged to the very highest society, since she knew Monsieur de Rohan, and that her own rank there was of the highest, since she spoke thus familiarly of so great a lord, and that there existed between them some connection, of relationship perhaps, but a very close one in any case, since she knew his pet name. 2 very severe duchesses, Mesdames de Choiseul and de Sérent, often visited the community, whither they penetrated, no doubt, in virtue of the privilege magnates mulieres, and caused great consternation in the boarding school. When these 2 old ladies passed by, all the poor young girls trembled and dropped their eyes. Moreover, Monsieur de Rohan, quite unknown to himself, was an object of attention to the schoolgirls. At that epoch he had just been made, while waiting for the episcopate, Vicar General of the Archbishop of Paris. It was one of his habits to come tolerably often to celebrate the offices in the chapel of the nuns of the Petit Picpus. Not one of the young recluses could see him because of the serge curtain, but he had a sweet and rather shrill voice, which they had come to know and to distinguish. He had been a mousquetaire, and then he was said to be very coquettish, that his handsome brown hair was very well dressed in a roll around his head, and that he had a broad girdle of magnificent moire, and that his black cassock was of the most elegant cut in the world. He held a great place in all these imaginations of 16 years. Not a sound from without made its way into the convent, but there was one year when the sound of a flute penetrated thither. This was an event, and the girls who were at school there at the time still recall it. It was a flute which was played in the neighbourhood. This flute always played the same air, an air which is very far away nowadays. My Zetulbé, come reign o'er my soul, and it was heard 2 or 3 times a day. The young girls passed hours in listening to it, the vocal mothers were upset by it, brains were busy, punishments descended in showers. This lasted for several months. The girls were all more or less in love with the unknown musician. Each one dreamed that she was Zetulbé. The sound of the flute proceeded from the direction of the Rue Droit-Mur, and they would have given anything, compromised everything, attempted anything, for the sake of seeing, of catching a glance, if only for a second, of the young man who played that flute so deliciously, and who, no doubt, played on all these souls at the same time. There were some who made their escape by a back door and ascended to the third story on the Rue Droit-Mur side in order to attempt to catch a glimpse through the gaps. Impossible. One even went so far as to thrust her arm through the grating and to wave her white handkerchief. Two were still bolder. They found means to climb on a roof and risk their lives there, and succeeded at last in seeing the young man. He was an old émigré gentleman, blind and penniless, who was playing his flute in his attic in order to pass the time. End of Book 6, Chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabelle Florence Hapgood. Book 6, Le Petit Picpus. Chapter 6, The Little Convent. In this enclosure of the Petit Picpus there were three perfectly distinct buildings: the great convent inhabited by the nuns, the boarding school where the scholars were lodged, and lastly, what was called the little convent. It was a building with a garden, in which lived all sorts of aged nuns of various orders, the relics of cloisters destroyed in the Revolution, a reunion of all the black, grey, and white medleys of all communities, and all possible varieties. What might be called, if such a coupling of words is permissible, a sort of harlequin convent. When the Empire was established, all those poor, old, dispersed, and exiled women had been accorded permission to come and take shelter under the wings of the Bernardine Benedictine. The government paid them a small pension. The ladies of the Petit Picpus received them cordially. It was a singular pêle-mêle. Each followed her own rule. Sometimes the pupils of the boarding school were allowed, as a great recreation, to pay them a visit. The result is that all those young memories have retained amongst other souvenirs that of Mother Saint Basile, Mother Saint Scholastique, and Mother Jacob. One of these refugees found herself almost at home. She was a nun of Sainte-Aure, the only one of her order who had survived. The ancient convent of the ladies of Sainte-Aure occupied, at the beginning of the 18th century, this very house of the Petit Picpus, which belonged later to the Benedictines of Martin Verga. This holy woman, too poor to wear the magnificent habit of her order, which was a white robe with a scarlet scapulary, had piously put it on a little mannikin, which she exhibited with complacency, and which she bequeathed to the house at her death. In 1824, only one nun of this order remained. Today there remains only a doll. In addition to these worthy mothers, some old society women had obtained permission of the prioress, like Madame Albertine, to retire into the little convent. Among the number were Madame Beaufort d'Hautpoul and Marquise Dufresne. Another was never known in the convent, except by the formidable noise which she made when she blew her nose. The pupils called her Madame Varcamini, hubbub. About 1820 or 1821, Madame de Genlis, who was at that time editing a little periodical publication called L'Intrépide, asked to be allowed to enter the convent of the Petit Picpus as lady resident. The Duc d'Orléans recommended her. Uproar in the hive. The vocal mothers were all in a flutter. Madame de Genlis had made romances, but she declared that she was the first to detest them, and then she had reached her fierce stage of devotion. With the aid of God and of the prince, she entered. She departed at the end of 6 or 8 months, alleging as a reason that there was no shade in the garden, that nuns were delighted. Although very old, she still played the harp, and did it very well. When she went away, she left her mark in her cell. Madame de Genlis was superstitious and a Latinist. These 2 words furnish a tolerably good profile of her. A few years ago, there was still to be seen, pasted in the inside of a little cupboard in her cell, which she locked up her silverware and her jewels, these 5 lines in Latin, written with her own hand in red ink on yellow paper, and which, in her opinion, possessed the property of frightening away robbers. Imparibus merites pendent tria corporaramis, dismasse gemas, mediae divina potestas, alta pitetismas infeliz infima gesmas, nos et res nostras conservet summa potestas, os versus dicas, ne tu furto tua perdas. These verses in 6th century Latin raise the question whether the 2 thieves of Calgary were named, as is commonly believed, Dimae gestas, or Dismasi gesmas. This orthography might have confounded the pretensions put forward in the last century by the Vicomte de Gista of a descent from the wicked thief. However, the useful virtue attached to these verses forms an article of faith in the order of the Hospitalier. The church of the house, constructed in such a manner as to separate the great convent from the boarding school like a veritable entrenchment, was, of course, common to the boarding school, the great convent, and the little convent. The public was even admitted by a sort of lazaretto entrance on the street, but all was so arranged that none of the inhabitants of the cloister could see a face from the outside world. Suppose a church whose choir is grasped in a gigantic hand, and folded in such a manner as to form, not, as in ordinary churches, a prolongation behind the altar, but a sort of hall, or obscure cellar, to the right of the officiating priest. Suppose this hall to be shut off by a curtain 7 feet in height, of which we have already spoken. In the shadow of that curtain, pile up on wooden stalls the nuns in the choir on the left, the schoolgirls on the right, the lay sisters and the novices at the bottom, and you will have some idea of the nuns of the Petit Picpus assisting at divine service. That cavern, which was called a choir, communicated with the cloister by a lobby. The church was lighted from the garden. When the nuns were present at services, where their rule enjoined silence, the public was warned of their presence only by the folding seats of the stalls, noisily rising and falling. End of Book 6, Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 2. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabelle Florence Hapgood. Book 6, Le Petit Picpus. Chapter 7, Some Silhouettes of this Darkness. During the 6 years which separate 1819 from 1825, the prioress of the Petit Picpus was Mademoiselle de Blemeur, whose name in religion was Mother Innocente. She came of the family of Marguerite de Blemeur, author of Lives of the Saints of the Order of Saint Benoit. She had been re-elected. She was a woman about 60 years of age, short, thick, singing like a cracked pot, says the letter which we have already quoted. An excellent woman, moreover, and the only merry one in the whole convent, and for that reason adored. She was learned, erudite, wise, competent, curiously proficient in history, crammed with Latin, stuffed with Greek, full of Hebrew, and more of a Benedictine monk than a Benedictine nun. The sub-prioress was an old Spanish man, Mother Cineres, who was almost blind. The most esteemed among the vocal mothers was Mother Sainte Honorine, the treasurer, Mother Sainte Gertrude, the chief mistress of the novices, Mother Saint Ange, the assistant mistress, Mother Annonciation, the sacristan, Mother Saint Augustine, the nurse, the only one in the convent who was malicious, then Mother Sainte Mechtilde, Mademoiselle Gauvin, very young and with a beautiful voice, Mother des Anges, Mademoiselle Drouet, who had been in the convent of the Filles Dieu and in the convent du Trésor between Gisors and Magny, Mother Saint Joseph, Mademoiselle de Gogoludu, Mother Sainte Adelaide, Mademoiselle d'Auvernay, Mother Misérables, Mademoiselle de Cifuentes, who could not resist austerities, Mother Compassion, Mademoiselle de la Mitière, received at the age of 60 in defiance of the rule and very wealthy, Mother Providence, Mademoiselle de Laudonnière, Mother Presentation, Mademoiselle de Sigenza, who was prioress in 1847, and finally Mother Sainte Céline, sister of the sculptor Seracchi, who went mad, Mother Sainte Chantal, Mademoiselle de Suzon, who went mad. There was also, among the prettiest of them, a charming girl of 23, who was from the Isle du Bourbon, a descendant of the Chevalier Rose, whose name had been Mademoiselle Rose, and who was called Mother Assumption. Mother Sainte Mechtilde, entrusted with the singing in the choir, was fond of making use of the pupils in this quarter. She usually took a complete scale of them, that is to say, 7, from 10 to 16 years of age inclusive, of assorted voices and sizes, whom she made sing standing, drawn up in a line, side by side, according to age, from the smallest to the largest. This presented to the eye something in the nature of a reed pipe of young girls, a sort of living panpipe made of angels. Those of the lay sisters whom the scholars loved most were Sister Euphrasie, Sister Sainte Marguerite, Sister Sainte Marthe, who was in her dotage, and Sister Saint Michel, whose long nose made them laugh. All these women were gentle with the children. The nuns were severe only towards themselves. No fire was lighted except in the school, and the food was choice compared to that in the convent. Moreover, they lavished 1,000 cares on their scholars. Only, when a child passed near a nun and addressed her, the nun never replied. This rule of silence had had this effect, that throughout the whole convent, speech had been withdrawn from human creatures and bestowed on inanimate objects. Now it was the church bell which spoke, now it was the gardener's bell, a very sonorous bell placed beside the portress, and which was audible throughout the house, indicated by its varied peals, which formed a sort of acoustic telegraph, all the actions of material life which were to be performed and summoned to the parlour, in case of need, such or such an inhabitant of the house. Each person and each thing had its own peal. The prioress had 1 and 1, the sub-prioress 1 and 2. 6-5 announced lessons, so that the pupils never said go to lessons, but to go to 6-5. 4-4 was Madame de Genlis's signal. It was very often heard. C'est le diable à 4. It's the very deuce, said the uncharitable. 10 strokes announced a great event. It was the opening of the door of seclusion, a frightful sheet of iron bristling with bolts which only turned on its hinges in the presence of the archbishop. With the exception of the archbishop and the gardener, no man entered the convent, as we have already said. The schoolgirls saw 2 others, one the chaplain, the Abbé Ban, old and ugly, whom they were permitted to contemplate in the choir through a grating. The other, the drawing-master, Monsieur Ansiot, whom the latter, of which we have perused a few lines, calls Monsieur Ansiot, and describes as a frightful old hunchback. It will be seen that all these men were carefully chosen. Such was this curious house. End of Book 6.
Chapter 8 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 6, Le Petit Picpus, Chapter 8, Post Corda Lapides. After having sketched its moral face, it will not prove unprofitable to point out in a few words its material configuration. The reader already has some idea of it. The convent of the Petit Picpus Saint-Antoine filled almost the whole of the vast trapezium which resulted from the intersection of the Rue Polonceau, the Rue Droit-Mur, the Rue Petit Picpus, and the unused lane called Rue Aumarais on old plans. These 4 streets surrounded this trapezium like a moat. The convent was composed of several buildings and a garden. The principal building, taken in its entirety, was a juxtaposition of hybrid constructions which, viewed from a bird's-eye view, outlined with considerable exactness a gibbet laid flat on the ground. The main arm of the gibbet occupied the whole of the fragment of the Rue Droit-Mur, comprised between the Rue Petit Picpus and the Rue Polonceau. The lesser arm was a lofty, grey, severe, grated façade which faced the Rue Petit Picpus. The carriage entrance No. 62 marked its extremity. Towards the centre of this façade was a low arched door, whitened with dust and ashes, where the spiders wove their webs, and which was open only for an hour or 2 on Sundays, and on rare occasions when the coffin of a nun left the convent. This was the public entrance of the church. The elbow of the gibbet was a square hall, which was used as the servants' hall, and which the nuns called the buttery. In the main arm were the cells of the mothers, the sisters, and the novices. In the lesser arm lay the kitchens, the refectory, backed up by the cloisters and the church. Between the door No. 62 and the corner of the closed lane Aumarais was the school, which was not visible from without. The remainder of the trapezium formed the garden, which was much lower than the level of the Rue Polonceau, which caused the walls to be very much higher on the inside than on the outside. The garden, which was slightly arched, had in its centre, on the summit of a hillock, a fine pointed and conical fir tree, whence ran, as from the peaked boss of a shield, 4 grand alleys, and ranged by 2s in between the branchings of these 8 small ones, so that, if the enclosure had been circular, the geometrical plan of the alleys would have resembled a cross superposed on a wheel. As the alleys all ended in the very irregular walls of the garden, they were of unequal length. They were bordered with currant bushes. At the bottom, an alley of tall poplars ran from the ruins of the old convent, which was at the angle of the Rue Droit-Mur, to the house of the little convent, which was at the angle of the Aumarais lane. In front of the little convent was what was called the little garden. To this whole let the reader add a courtyard, all sorts of varied angles formed by the interior buildings, prison walls, the long black line of roofs which bordered the other side of the Rue Polonceau for its sole perspective and neighbourhood, and he will be able to form for himself a complete image of what the house of the Bernardines of the Petit Picpus was 40 years ago. This holy house had been built on the precise site of a famous tennis ground of the 14th to the 16th century, which was called the tennis ground of the 11,000 devils. All these streets, moreover, were more ancient than Paris. These names, Droit Mur and Aumarais, are very ancient. The streets which bear them are very much more ancient still. Aumarais Lane was called Maugout Lane. The Rue Droit Mur was called the Rue des Églantiers, for God opened flowers before man cut stones. End of Book 6, Chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel F. Hapgood. Chapter 9. A Century Under a Gimp. Since we are engaged in giving details as to what the convent of the Petit Picpus was in former times, and since we have ventured to open a window on that discreet retreat, the reader will permit us one other little digression, utterly foreign to this book, but characteristic and useful, since it shows that the cloister even has its original figures. In the little convent there was a centenarian who came from the abbey of Fontevraud. She had even been in society before the Revolution. She talked a great deal of M. de Miromesnel, keeper of the seals under Louis XVI, and of a Presidentess Duplat, with whom she had been very intimate. It was her pleasure and her vanity to drag in these names on every pretext. She told wonders of the abbey of Fontevraud, that it was like a city, and that there were streets in the monastery. She talked with a Picard accent which amused the pupils. Every year she solemnly renewed her vows, and at the moment of taking the oath, she said to the priest, Monseigneur Saint Francois gave it to Monseigneur Saint Julien, Monseigneur Saint Julien gave it to Monseigneur Saint Eusebius, Monseigneur Saint Eusebius gave it to Monseigneur Saint Procopius, etc., etc., and thus I give it to you, Father. And the schoolgirls would begin to laugh, not in their sleeves, but under their veils, charming little stifled laughs, which made the vocal mothers frown. On another occasion, the centenarian was telling stories. She said that in her youth the Bernardine monks were every whit as good as the mousquetaires. It was a century which spoke through her, but it was the 18th century. She told about the custom of the 4 wines, which existed before the Revolution in Champagne and Bourgogne. When a great personage, a marshal of France, a prince, a duke, and a peer, traversed a town in Burgundy or Champagne, the city fathers came out to harangue him and presented him with 4 silver gondolas into which they had poured 4 different sorts of wine. On the first goblet this inscription could be read, Monkey wine, on the second, Lion wine, on the third, Sheep wine, on the fourth, Hog wine. These 4 legends express the 4 stages descended by the drunkard. The first, intoxication, which enlivens; the second, that which irritates; the third, that which dulls; and the fourth, that which brutalizes. In a cupboard, under lock and key, she kept a mysterious object of which she thought a great deal. The rule of Fontevraud did not forbid this. She would not show this object to anyone. She shut herself up, which her rule allowed her to do, and hid herself, every time that she desired to contemplate it. If she heard a footstep in the corridor, she closed the cupboard again as hastily as it was possible with her aged hands. As soon as it was mentioned to her, she became silent, she was so fond of talking. The most curious were baffled by her silence, and the most tenacious by her obstinacy. Thus it furnished a subject of comment for all those who were unoccupied or bored in the convent. What could that treasure of the centenarian be, which was so precious and so secret? Some holy book, no doubt? Some unique chaplet? Some authentic relic? They lost themselves in conjectures. When the poor old woman died, they rushed to her cupboard more hastily than was fitting, perhaps, and opened it. They found the object beneath a triple linen cloth, like some consecrated paten. It was a Faenza platter, representing little loves flitting away, pursued by apothecary lads armed with enormous syringes. The chase abounds in grimaces and in comical postures. One of the charming little loves is already fairly spitted. He is resisting, fluttering his tiny wings, and still making an effort to fly, but the dancer is laughing with a satanical air. Moral: love conquered by the colic. This platter, which is very curious, and which had possibly the honour of furnishing Molière with an idea, was still in existence in September 1845. It was for sale by a bric-a-brac merchant in the Boulevard Beaumarchais. This good old woman would not receive any visits from outside, because, said she, the parlour is too gloomy. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 6, Le Petit Picpus, Chapter 10, Origin of the Perpetual Adoration. However, this almost sepulchral parlour, of which we have sought to convey an idea, is a purely local trait, which is not reproduced with the same severity in other convents. At the convent of the Rue du Temple, in particular, which belonged in truth to another order, the black shutters were replaced by brown curtains, and the parlour itself was a salon with a polished wood floor, whose windows were draped in white muslin curtains, and whose walls admitted all sorts of frames, a portrait of a Benedictine nun with unveiled face, painted bouquets, and even the head of a Turk. It is in that garden of the Temple convent that stood that famous chestnut tree which was renowned as the finest and the largest in France, and which bore the reputation among the good people of the 18th century of being the father of all the chestnut trees of the realm. As we have said, this convent of the Temple was occupied by Benedictines of the Perpetual Adoration, Benedictines quite different from those who depended on Cîteaux. This order of the Perpetual Adoration is not very ancient, and does not go back more than 200 years. In 1649, the Holy Sacrament was profaned on 2 occasions a few days apart in 2 churches in Paris, at Saint-Sulpice and at Saint-Jean-en-Grève, a rare and frightful sacrilege which set the whole town in an uproar. Monsieur the Prior and Vicar General of Saint-Germain-des-Prés ordered a solemn procession of all his clergy, in which the Pope's nuncio officiated. But this expiation did not satisfy 2 sainted women, Madame Courtin, Marquise de Boucs, and the Comtesse de Châteauvieux. This outrage, committed on the most holy sacrament of the altar, though but temporary, would not depart from these holy souls, and it seemed to them that it could only be extenuated by a perpetual adoration in some female monastery. Both of them, one in 1652, the other in 1653, made donations of notable sums to Mother Catherine de Bar, called of the Holy Sacrament, a Benedictine nun, for the purpose of founding, to this pious end, a monastery of the order of Saint-Benoît. The first permission for this foundation was given to Mother Catherine de Bar by Monsieur de Metz, Abbé of Saint-Germain, on condition that no woman could be received unless she contributed 300 livres income, which amounts to 6,000 livres, to the principal. After the Abbé of Saint-Germain, the king accorded letters patent, and all the rest, abbatial charter and royal letters, was confirmed in 1654 by the Chamber of Accounts and the Parliament. Such is the origin of the legal consecration of the establishment of the Benedictines of the Perpetual Adoration of the Holy Sacrament at Paris. Their first convent was a new building in the Rue Cassette, out of the contributions of Mesdames de Boucs and de Châteauvieux. This order, as it will be seen, was not to be confounded with the Benedictine nuns of Cîteaux. It mounted back to the Abbé of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, in the same manner that the Ladies of the Sacred Heart go back to the General of the Jesuits, and the Sisters of Charity to the General of the Lazarists. It was also totally different from the Bernardines of the Petit Picpus, whose interior we have just shown. In 1657, Pope Alexander VII had authorised, by a special brief, the Bernardines of the Rue Petit-Picpus to practise the perpetual adoration, like the Benedictine nuns of the Holy Sacrament. But the two orders remained distinct none the less. End of Book 6, Chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 6, Le Petit Picpus. Chapter 11. End of the Petit Picpus. At the beginning of the Restoration, the convent of the Petit Picpus was in its decay. This forms a part of the general death of the order, which after the 18th century has been disappearing, like all the religious orders. Contemplation is, like prayer, one of humanity's needs. But, like everything which the Revolution touched, it will be transformed, and from being hostile to social progress, it will become favorable to it. The house of the Petit Picpus was becoming rapidly depopulated. In 1840, the little convent had disappeared, the school had disappeared. There were no longer any old women, nor young girls. The first were dead, the latter had taken their departure. Volle verunt. The rule of the perpetual adoration is so rigid in its nature that it alarms, vocations recoil before it, the order receives no recruits. In 1845 it still obtained lay sisters here and there, but of professed nuns, none at all. 40 years ago the nuns numbered nearly 100. 15 years ago there were not more than 28 of them. How many are there today? In 1847 the prioress was young, a sign that the circle of choice was restricted. She was not 40 years old. In proportion as the number diminishes, the fatigue increases, the service of each becomes more painful. The moment could then be seen drawing near, when there would be but a dozen bent and aching shoulders to bear the heavy rule of Saint-Benoît. The burden is implacable, and remains the same for the few as for the many. It weighs down, it crushes. Thus they die. At the period when the author of this book still lived in Paris, 2 died. One was 25 years old, the other 23. This latter can say, like Julia Alpinula, Hic iaceo, vixi annus viginti et tres. It is in consequence of this decay that the convent gave up the education of girls. We have not felt able to pass before this extraordinary house without entering it, and without introducing the minds which accompany us and which are listening to our tale to the profit of some perchance, of the melancholy history of Jean Valjean. We have penetrated into this community, full of those old practices which seem so novel today. It is the closed garden, hortus conclusus. We have spoken of this singular place in detail, but with respect in so far at least as detail and respect are compatible. We do not understand all, but we insult nothing. We are equally far removed from the hosanna of Joseph de Maistre, who wound up by anointing the executioner, and from the sneer of Voltaire, who even goes so far as to ridicule the cross. An illogical act on Voltaire's part, we may remark by the way, for Voltaire would have defended Jesus as he defended Callus. And even for those who deny superhuman incarnations, what does the crucifix represent? The assassinated sage. In this 19th century, the religious idea is undergoing a crisis. People are unlearning certain things, and they do well, provided that, while unlearning them, they learn this. There is no vacuum in the human heart. Certain demolitions take place, and it is well that they do, but on condition that they are followed by reconstructions. In the meantime, let us study things which are no more. It is necessary to know them, if only for the purpose of avoiding them. The counterfeits of the past assume false names, and gladly call themselves the future. This spectre, this past, is given to falsifying its own passport. Let us inform ourselves of the trap. Let us be on our guard. The past has a visage, superstition, and a mask, hypocrisy. Let us denounce the visage, and let us tear off the mask. As for convents, they present a complex problem. A question of civilization, which condemns them. A question of liberty, which protects them. End of Book 6, Chapter 11.
Chapter 1 of Book 7 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 7th, parenthesis. Chapter 1, The Convent as an Abstract Idea. This book is a drama whose leading personage is the infinite. Man is the second. Such being the case, and a convent having happened to be on our road, it has been our duty to enter it. Why? Because the convent, which is common to the Orient as well as to the Occident, to antiquity as well as to modern times, to paganism, to Buddhism, to Mahometanism, as well as to Christianity, is one of the optical apparatuses applied by man to the infinite. This is not the place for enlarging disproportionately on certain ideas. Nevertheless, while absolutely maintaining our reserves, our restrictions, and even our indignations, we must say that every time we encounter man in the infinite, either well or ill understood, we feel ourselves overpowered with respect. There is, in the synagogue, in the mosque, in the pagoda, in the wigwam, a hideous side which we execrate, and a sublime side which we adore. What a contemplation for the mind, and what endless food for thought, is the reverberation of God upon the human wall. End of Book 7th, Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Book 7 of Les Misérables, Volume 2 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 7, parenthesis, Chapter 2. The Convent as an Historical Fact. From the point of view of history, of reason, and of truth, monasticism is condemned. Monasteries, when they abound in a nation, are clogs in its circulation, cumbrous establishments, centers of idleness, where centers of labor should exist. Monastic communities are to the great social community what the mistletoe is to the oak, what the wart is to the human body. Their prosperity and their fatness mean the impoverishment of the country. The monastic regime, good at the beginning of civilization, useful in the reduction of the brutal by the spiritual, is bad when peoples have reached their manhood. Moreover, when it becomes relaxed, and when it enters into its period of disorder, it becomes bad for the very reasons which rendered it salutary in its period of purity, because it still continues to set the example. Claustration has had its day. Cloisters, useful in the early education of modern civilization, have embarrassed its growth, and are injurious to its development. So far as institution and formation with relation to man are concerned, monasteries, which were good in the 10th century, questionable in the 15th, are detestable in the 19th. The leprosy of monasticism has gnawed nearly to a skeleton two wonderful nations, Italy and Spain, the one the light, the other the splendor of Europe for centuries, and at the present day these two illustrious peoples are but just beginning to convalesce, thanks to the healthy and vigorous hygiene of 1789 alone. The convent, the ancient female convent in particular, such as it still presents itself on the threshold of this century, in Italy, in Austria, in Spain, is one of the most somber concretions of the Middle Ages. The cloister, that cloister, is the point of intersection of horrors. The Catholic cloister, properly speaking, is wholly filled with the black radiance of death. The Spanish convent is the most funereal of all. There rise in obscurity, beneath vaults filled with gloom, beneath domes vague with shadow, massive altars of Babel, as high as cathedrals. Their immense white crucifixes hang from chains in the dark. There are extended, all nude on the ebony, great Christs of ivory, more than bleeding, bloody, hideous and magnificent, with their elbows displaying the bones, their knee-pans showing their integuments, their wounds showing their flesh, crowned with silver thorns, nailed with nails of gold, with blood drops of rubies on their brows, and diamond tears in their eyes. The diamonds and rubies seem wet, and make veiled beings in the shadow below weep. Their sides bruised with the hair shirt and their iron-tipped scourges, their breasts crushed with wicker hurdles, their knees excoriated with prayer. Women who think themselves wives, spectres who think themselves seraphim. Do these women think? No. Have they any will? No. Do they love? No. Do they live? No. Their nerves have turned to bone, their bones have turned to stone. Their veil is of woven night. Their breath under their veil resembles the indescribably tragic respiration of death. The abbess, a spectre, sanctifies them and terrifies them. The Immaculate One is there, and very fierce. Such are the ancient monasteries of Spain, lyres of terrible devotion, caverns of virgins, ferocious places. Catholic Spain is more Roman than Rome herself. The Spanish convent was, above all others, the Catholic convent. There was a flavor of the Orient about it. The archbishop, the Kislar Aga of heaven, locked up and kept watch over the seraglio of souls reserved for God. The nun was the odalisque, the priest was the eunuch. The fervent were chosen in dreams and possessed Christ. At night, the beautiful nude young man descended from the cross and became the ecstasy of the cloistered one. Lofty walls guarded the mystic sultana, who had the crucified for her sultan, from all living distraction. A glance in the outer world was infidelity. The in-pace replaced the leather sack. That which was cast into the sea in the east was thrown into the ground in the west. In both quarters women wrung their hands, the waves for the first, the grave for the last, here the drowned, there the buried. Monstrous parallel. Today the upholders of the past, unable to deny these things, have adopted the expedient of smiling at them. There has come into fashion a strange and easy manner of suppressing the revelations of history, of invalidating the commentaries of philosophy, of eliding all embarrassing facts and all gloomy questions. A matter for declamations, say the clever. Declamations repeat the foolish. Jean-Jacques, a declaimer. Diderot, a declaimer. Voltaire en Calas, Labarre, and Sirven, declaimers. I know not who has recently discovered that Tacitus was a declaimer, that Nero was a victim, and that pity is decidedly due to that poor Holofernes. Facts, however, are awkward things to disconcert, and they are obstinate. The author of this book has seen, with his own eyes, 8 leagues distant from Brussels. There are relics of the Middle Ages there which are attainable for everybody. At the Abbey of Villers, the whole of the oubliettes, in the middle of the field, which was formerly the courtyard of the cloister, and on the banks of the Till, 4 stone dungeons, half underground, half under the water. They were in pace. Each of these dungeons has the remains of an iron door, a vault, and a grated opening, which, on the outside, is 2 feet above the level of the river, and on the inside, 6 feet above the level of the ground. 4 feet of the river flow past along the outside wall. The ground is always soaked. The occupant of the in-pace had the wet soil for his bed. In one of these dungeons there is a fragment of an iron necklet riveted to the wall. In another there can be seen a square box made of 4 slabs of granite, too short for a person to lie down in, too low for him to stand upright in. A human being was put inside, with a coverlid of stone on top. This exists. It can be seen. It can be touched. These in pace, these dungeons, these iron hinges, these necklets, that lofty peephole on a level with the river's current, that box of stone closed with a lid of granite like a tomb, with this difference, that the dead man here was a living being, that soil which is but mud, that vault hole, those oozing walls, what declaimers. End of
Chapter 3 of Book 7 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 7, parenthesis. Chapter 3. On what conditions one can respect the past. Monasticism, such as it existed in Spain, and such as it still exists in Tibet, is a sort of thesis for civilization. It stops life short. It simply depopulates. Claustration, castration. It has been the scourge of Europe. Add to this the violence so often done to the conscience, the forced vocations, feudalism bolstered up by the cloister, the right of the firstborn pouring the excess of the family into monasticism, the ferocities of which we have just spoken, the in pace, the closed mouths, the walled-up brains. So many unfortunate minds, placed in the dungeon of eternal vows, the taking of the habit, the interment of living souls. Add individual tortures to national degradations, and whoever you may be, you will shudder before the frock and the veil, those two winding sheets of human devising. Nevertheless, at certain points and in certain places, in spite of philosophy, in spite of progress, the spirit of the cloister persists in the midst of the 19th century, and a singular ascetic recrudescence is at this moment astonishing the civilized world. The obstinacy of antiquated institutions in perpetuating themselves resembles the stubbornness of the rancid perfume which should claim our hair, the pretensions of the spoiled fish which should persist in being eaten, the persecution of the child's garment which should insist on clothing the man, the tenderness of corpses which should return to embrace the living. Ingrates, says the garment, I protected you in inclement weather. Why will you have nothing to do with me? I have just come from the deep sea, says the fish. I have been a rose, says the perfume. I have loved you, says the corpse. I have civilized you, says the convent. To this there is but one reply. In former days. To dream of the indefinite prolongation of defunct things, and of the government of men by embalming, to restore dogmas in a bad condition, to re-gild shrines, to patch up cloisters, to re-bless reliquaries, to re-furnish superstitions, to re-victual fanaticisms, to put new handles on holy water brushes and militarism, to reconstitute monasticism and militarism, to believe in the salvation of society by the multiplication of parasites, to force the past on the present. This seems strange. Still, there are theorists who hold such theories. These theorists, who are in other respects people of intelligence, have a very simple process. They apply to the past a glazing, which they call social order, divine right, morality, family, the respect of elders, antique authority, sacred tradition, legitimacy, religion. And they go about shouting, "Look, take this, honest people!" This logic was known to the ancients. The soothsayers practiced it. They rubbed a black heifer over with chalk, and said, "She is white, bos cretatus." As for us, we respect the past here and there, and we spare it, above all, provided that it consents to be dead. If it insists on being alive, we attack it, and we try to kill it. Superstitions, bigotries, affected devotion, prejudices, those forms, all forms as they are tenacious of life. They have teeth and nails in their smoke, and they must be clasped close, body to body, and war must be made on them, and that without truce. For it is one of the fatalities of humanity to be condemned to eternal combat with phantoms. It is difficult to seize darkness by the throat, and to hurl it to the earth. A convent in France, in the broad daylight of the 19th century, is a college of owls facing the light. A cloister caught in the very act of asceticism, in the very heart of the city of '89, and of 1830, and of 1848, Rome blossoming out in Paris, is an anachronism. In ordinary times, in order to dissolve an anachronism and to cause it to vanish, one has only to make it spell out the date. But we are not in ordinary times. Let us fight. Let us fight, but let us make a distinction. The peculiar property of truth is never to commit excesses. What need has it of exaggeration? There is that which it is necessary to destroy, and there is that which it is simply necessary to elucidate and examine. What a force is kindly and serious examination! Let us not apply a flame where only a light is required. So, given the 19th century, we are opposed as a general proposition and among all peoples, in Asia as well as in Europe, in India as well as in Turkey, to ascetic claustration. Whoever says cloister says marsh. Their putrescence is evident. Their stagnation is unhealthy. Their fermentation infects people with fever and etiolates them. Their multiplication becomes a plague of Egypt. We cannot think without affright of those lands where fakirs, bonzes, santons, Greek monks, marabouts, talapoins, and dervishes multiply, even like swarms of vermin. This said, the religious question remains. This question has certain mysterious, almost formidable sides. May we be permitted to look at it fixedly. End of Book 7, Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Book 7 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 7th, parenthesis. Chapter 4. The Convent from the Point of View of Principles. Men unite themselves and dwell in communities. By virtue of what right? By virtue of the right of association. They shut themselves up at home. By virtue of what right? By virtue of the right which every man has to open or shut his door. They do not come forth. By virtue of what right? By virtue of the right to go and come, which implies the right to remain at home. There, at home, what do? They speak in low tones. They drop their eyes. They toil. They renounce the world, towns, sensualities, pleasures, vanities, pride, interests. They are clothed in coarse woolen or coarse linen. Not one of them possesses in his own right anything whatever. On entering there, each one who was rich makes himself poor. What he has he gives to all. He who was what is called noble, a gentleman and a lord, is the equal of him who was a peasant. The cell is identical for all. All undergo the same tonsure, wear the same frock, eat the same black bread, sleep on the same straw, die on the same ashes. The same sack on their backs, the same rope around their loins. If the decision has been to go barefoot, all go barefoot. There may be a prince among them. That prince is the same shadow as the rest. No titles, even family names have disappeared, they bear only first names. All are bowed beneath the equality of baptismal names. They have dissolved the carnal family and constituted in their community a spiritual family. They have no other relatives than all men. They succour the poor, they care for the sick. They elect those whom they obey. They call each other my brother. You stop me and exclaim, but that is the ideal convent. It is sufficient that it may be the possible convent, that I should take notice of it. Thence it results that, in the preceding book, I have spoken of a convent with respectful accents. The Middle Ages cast aside, Asia cast aside, the historical and political question held in reserve, from the purely philosophical point of view, outside the requirements of militant policy, on condition that the monastery shall be absolutely a voluntary matter, and shall contain only consenting parties, I shall always consider a cloistered community with a certain attentive, and in some respects a deferential gravity. Wherever there is a community, there is a commune. Where there is a commune, there is right. The monastery is the product of the formula equality, fraternity. Oh, how grand is liberty! And what a splendid transfiguration! Liberty suffices to transform the monastery into a republic. Let us continue. But these men, or these women who are behind these four walls, they dress themselves in coarse woolen, they are equals, they call each other brothers, that is well. But they do something else? Yes. What? They gaze on the darkness, they kneel and they clasp their hands. What does this signify? End of Book 7th, Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Book 7 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 7th, parenthesis. Chapter 5, Prayer. They pray. To whom? To God. To pray to God, what is the meaning of these words? Is there an infinite beyond us? Is that infinite there, inherent, permanent, necessarily substantial since it is infinite, and because if it lacked matter it would be bounded? Necessarily intelligent since it is infinite, and because if it lacked intelligence it would end there? Does this infinite awaken in us the idea of essence, while we can attribute to ourselves only the idea of existence? In other terms, is it not the absolute, of which we are only the relative? At the same time that there is an infinite without us, is there not an infinite within us? Are not those two infinites, what an alarming plural, superposed, the one upon the other? Is not this second infinite, so to speak, subjacent to the first? Is it not the latter's mirror, reflection, echo, an abyss which is concentric with another abyss? Is this second infinity intelligent also? Does it think? Does it love? Does it will? If these two infinities are intelligent, each of them has a will principle, and there is an I in the upper infinity as there is an I in the lower infinity. The I below is the soul, the I on high is God. To place the infinity here below in contact, by the medium of thought, with the infinity on high, is called praying. Let us take nothing from the human mind. To suppress is bad. We must reform and transform. Certain faculties in man are directed towards the unknown: thought, reverie, prayer. The unknown is an ocean. What is conscience? It is the compass of the unknown. Thought, reverie, prayer, these are great and mysterious radiations. Let us respect them. Whither go these majestic irradiations of the soul? Into the shadow, that is to say, to the light. The grandeur of democracy is to disown nothing and to deny nothing of humanity. Close to the right of the man, beside it, at the least, there exists the right of the soul. To crush fanaticism and to venerate the infinite, such is the law. Let us not confine ourselves to prostrating ourselves before the tree of creation, and to the contemplation of its branches full of stars. We have a duty to labour over the human soul, to defend the mystery against the miracle, to adore the incomprehensible and reject the absurd, to admit as an inexplicable fact only what is necessary, to purify belief, to remove superstitions from above religion, to clear God of caterpillars. End of Book 7th, Chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Book 7 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 7, parentheses, Chapter 6, The Absolute Goodness of Prayer. With regard to the modes of prayer, all are good provided that they are sincere. Turn your book upside down and be in the infinite. There is, as we know, a philosophy which denies the infinite. There is also a philosophy, pathologically classified, which denies the sun. This philosophy is called blindness. To erect a sense which we lack into a source of truth is a fine blind man's self-sufficiency. The curious thing is the haughty, superior, and compassionate airs which this groping philosophy assumes toward the philosophy which beholds God. One fancies he hears a mole crying, "I pity them with their sun." There are, as we know, powerful and illustrious atheists. At bottom, led back to the truth by their very force, they are not absolutely sure that they are atheists. It is with them only a question of definition, and in any case, if they do not believe in God, being great minds, they prove God. We salute them as philosophers, while inexorably denouncing their philosophy. Let us go on. The remarkable thing about it is, also, their facility in paying themselves off with words. A metaphysical school of the North, impregnated to some extent with fog, has fancied that it has worked a revolution in human understanding by replacing the word force with the word will. To say, the plant wills, instead of the plant grows. This would be fecund in results, indeed, if we were to add, the universe wills. Why? Because it would come to this: the plant wills, therefore it has an I. The universe wills, therefore it has a God. As for us who, however, in contradistinction to this school, reject nothing a priori, a will in the plant, accepted by this school, appears to us more difficult to admit than a will in the universe denied by it. To deny the will of the infinite, that is to say, God, is impossible on any other conditions than a denial of the infinite. We have demonstrated this. The negation of the infinite leads straight to nihilism. Everything becomes a mental conception. With nihilism, no discussion is possible, for the nihilist logic doubts the existence of its interlocutor, and is not quite sure that it exists itself. From its point of view, it is possible that it may be for itself only a mental conception. Only, it does not perceive that all which has denied it admits in the lump, simply by the utterance of the word mind. In short, no way is open to the thought by a philosophy which makes all end in the monosyllable no. To no, there is only one reply, yes. Nihilism has no point. There is no such thing as nothingness. Zero does not exist. Everything is something. Nothing is nothing. Man lives by affirmation even more than by bread. Even to see and to show does not suffice. Philosophy should be an energy. It should have for effort and effect to ameliorate the condition of man. Socrates should enter into Adam and produce Marcus Aurelius. In other words, the man of wisdom should be made to emerge from the man of felicity. Eden should be changed into a lyceum. Science should be a cordial. To enjoy, what a sad aim, and what a paltry ambition. The brute enjoys. To offer thought to the thirst of men, to give them all as an elixir the notion of God, to make conscience and science fraternize in them, to render them just by this mysterious confrontation. Such is the function of real philosophy. Morality is a blossoming out of truths. Contemplation leads to action. The absolute should be practicable. It is necessary that the ideal should be breathable, drinkable, and eatable to the human mind. It is the ideal which has the right to say, "Take this." It is on this condition that it ceases to be a sterile love of science, and becomes the one and sovereign mode of human rallying, and that philosophy herself is promoted to religion. Philosophy should not be a corbel erected on mystery to gaze upon it at its ease, without any other result than that of being convenient to curiosity. For our part, adjourning the development of our thought to another occasion, we will confine ourselves to saying that we neither understand man as a point of departure nor progress as an end, without those two forces which are their two motors, faith and love. Progress is the goal, the ideal is the type. What is this ideal? It is God. Ideal, absolute, perfection, infinity. Identical words. End of Book 7, Chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of Book 7 of Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 2, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 7th, parenthesis, Chapter 7, Precautions to be observed in blame. History and philosophy have eternal duties, which are at the same time simple duties. To combat Caiaphas the high priest, Draco the lawgiver, Trimalcion the legislator, Tiberius the emperor. This is clear, direct, and limpid, and offers no obscurity. But the right to live apart, even with its inconveniences and its abuses, insists on being stated and taken into account. Cenobitism is a human problem. When one speaks of convents, those abodes of error but of innocence, of aberration but of goodwill, of ignorance but of devotion, of torture but of martyrdom, it always becomes necessary to say either yes or no. A convent is a contradiction. Its object, salvation. Its means thereto, sacrifice. The convent is supreme egoism, having for its result supreme abnegation. To abdicate with the object of reigning seems to be the device of monasticism. In the cloister one suffers in order to enjoy. One draws a bill of exchange on death. One discounts in terrestrial gloom celestial light. In the cloister hell is accepted in advance as a post-obit on paradise. The taking of the veil or the frock is a suicide paid for with eternity. It does not seem to us that on such a subject mockery is permissible. All about it is serious, the good as well as the bad. The just man frowns, but never smiles with a malicious sneer. We understand wrath, but not malice. End of Book 7th, Chapter 7.
This is a LibriVox recording. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Volume 2, Book 7, Chapter 8, Faith, Law. A few words more. We blame the Church when she is saturated with intrigues. We despise the spiritual which is harsh toward the temporal. But we, everywhere, honor the thoughtful man. We salute the man who nears. A faith, this is a necessity for man. Woe to him who believes nothing. One is not unoccupied because one is absorbed. There is visible labor and invisible labor. To contemplate is to labor, to think is to act. Folded arms toil, clasped hands work. A gaze fixed on heaven is a work. Thales remained motionless for 4 years. He founded philosophy. In our opinion, cenobites are not lazy men, and recluses are not idlers. To meditate on the shadow is a serious thing. Without invalidating anything that we have just said, we believe that a perpetual memory of the tomb is proper for the living. On this point, the priest and the philosopher agree. We must die. The Abbé de la Trempe replies to Horace. To mingle with one's life, a certain presence of the sepulchre. This is the law of the sage, and it is the law of the ascetic. In this respect, the ascetic and the sage converge. There is a material growth, we admit it. There is a moral grandeur, we hold to that. Thoughtless and vivacious spirits say, "What is the good of those motionless figures on the side of mystery? What purpose do they serve? What do they do?" Alas! In the presence of the darkness which environs us, and which awaits us, in our ignorance of what the immense dispersion will make of us, we reply, there is probably no work more divine than that performed by these souls. And we add, there is probably no work which is more useful. There certainly must be some who pray constantly for those who never pray at all. In our opinion, the whole question lies in the amount of thought that is mingled with prayer. Leibniz's praying is grand, Voltaire adoring is fine. Dieu exercit futile. We are for religion as against religions. We are of the number who believe in the wretchedness of orisons and the sublimity of prayer. Moreover, at this minute which we are now traversing, a minute which will not, fortunately, leave its impress on the 19th century, at this hour when so many men have low brows and souls but little elevated, among so many mortals whose morality consists in enjoyment, and who are busied with the brief and misshapen things of matter, whoever excites himself seems worthy of veneration to us. The monastery is a renunciation. Sacrifice wrongly directed is still sacrifice. To mistake a grave error for a duty has a grandeur of its own. Taken by itself, and ideally, and in order to examine the truth on all sides until all aspects have been impartially exhausted, the monastery, the female convent in particular, for in our century it is woman who suffers the most, and in this exile of the cloister there is something of protestation. The female convent has incontestably a certain majesty. This cloistered existence, which is so austere, so depressing, a few of whose features we have just traced, is not life, for it is not liberty. It is not a tomb, for it is not plenitude. It is the strange place whence one beholds, as from the crest of a lofty mountain, on one side the abyss where we are, on the other the abyss whither we shall go. It is the narrow and misty frontier separating two worlds, illuminated and obscured by both at the same time, where the ray of life which has become enfeebled is mingled with the vague ray of death. It is the half-obscurity of the tomb. We, who do not believe what these women believe, but who, like them, live by faith, we have never been able to think without a sort of tender and religious terror, without a sort of pity that is full of envy, of those devoted, trembling, and trusting creatures, of these humble and august souls, who dare to dwell on the very brink of the mystery, waiting between the world which is closed and the heaven which is not yet open, turned towards the light which one cannot see, possessing the sole happiness of thinking that they know where it is, aspiring towards the gulf and the unknown, their eyes fixed motionless on the darkness, kneeling, bewildered, stupefied, shuddering, half lifted, at times, by the deep breeze of eternity. End of chapter 8. Les Misérables, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood.